Nigel, you're very welcome.
Thank you. I like the entry music.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it?
That's very good.
This has been an unbelievable success story for you guys. Maybe before we get into the massive growth that you've had over the last 24 months, just take us back a couple of years to when this idea actually comes to fruition.
Yeah, so, I always say that sort of FanDuel started in failure. It was our second startup, same co-founders, we had 5 co-founders. And in 2008, we launched this prediction game called HubDub, which was a lot of fun. Journalists loved it, users loved it. You could predict the outcome of news stories. The only problem was it didn't have a business model. And our investors started to get frustrated with that. And we, at the start of 2009, we decided to go to South by Southwest. And we got on a flight, there was 5 of us, and we really sat outside a house we had rented. And we sort of said, look, what's your best ideas? We literally got Post-it notes. And I don't think we had any good ideas. We had one idea, which was fantasy sports. And that was the start of the business. And we really looked at fantasy sports and we were surprised. We said, at the time, there was 30 million people playing it. They loved it. They would play 5-10 hours a week. But the game lasted 5 months. And we were like, I can't think of any game that takes 5 months to complete. You ask a typical millennial, do you want to play a game that takes 5 months to complete? And so we just thought that we could make it faster and we could make it more mobile and we could just do it better. And that was really the genesis.
Because the big difference between European fantasy sports, well, the Premier League fantasy and NFL fantasy, which are the kind of 2 dominant territories, the one in the UK, everybody picks the best players.
Yes.
And they don't do that. There's obviously a draft, and that's that's the unique selling point of the draft in the States. But for you guys, you kind of combine a little bit of this.
Yeah, that's right. So in the US, for the people who are not familiar with US fantasy sports, very typically a group of your sort of college buddies or work buddies will take a day prior to the start of the season. You'll all go and sit in a room, or you'll get beer, you'll get chips, and you'll basically spend the next 3 hours picking players in a what they call a snake draft. So the first person who gets the first pick will pick the top player, and that will come off the board, and then the next person will, and you basically all will assemble unique rosters, and that's your team for the season. You might do a bit of trading between each other, and you talk to somebody who plays fantasy sports in the US, and they'll say, draft day, best day of their life. It's the time when they get together their friends. It's a new season. They get to pick a new team. Everything's good. And you ask them, what's the worst day of their life? And they say it's usually around week 6 when their star player gets injured and the season goes downhill.
Yeah. That's a problem if you want to do it every week. You can't have a draft every week.
Well, that was, and so that was what we identified. And we talked to the people who played it, and they said, look, draft day I love. I love the fresh start with a new team. And I love the excitement of that, but the problem is, when you get into week 6, week 7, Des Bryant gets injured, Adrian Peterson gets suspended for domestic abuse. These are things I can't control, and they're really frustrating because it means I lose for something I can't control. And so we said, well, what if you could pick a new team every day, every week for NFL, every day for basketball? And that was a big part of what we thought would make it better.
Okay, so then how does that work? How many people are in each individual league? What's the format for that?
So the other thing that we wanted to do was bring variety. So a typical league in season long is 12 players, all right? And you're all friends, you all know each other. And we said, well, what if the typical league could be 100 players or 1,000 players, or some of our biggest leagues have got 400,000 players, right? And so that was, with our game, you're picking players under a salary cap. So every player's got a salary, and so your best players, Tom Brady, he's going to be very expensive. And so you pick him and you pick top priced running backs, and then you start to run out of money, and then you're down in the scrubs, and then you're like, okay, maybe I can't take Brady. You're trying to find the optimal team under the salary cap. And what you do with that team is then you can enter a tournament or a game. That could be just a head-to-head against one other person, or it could be, say, our Sunday Million tournament, where it'll have in the region of several 100,000 entries, several 100,000 other players that week that you're competing against.
And some of those people will have exactly the same team as you?
Actually, overlap is something we worried about early on. There was going to be so much overlap. Surprisingly rare. It's actually, when we had a statistician look at it, and he said there's something like 3 billion possible combinations. And so when you actually go through that, there is overlap in that. People look at percentage owned, so that's a player that's, a high percentage owned is a player that's very heavily owned.
Sure.
And you'll see that, but having completely unique teams, that's fairly rare.
Okay, and that's where this becomes really interesting for people to put in multiple teams. They're like, if I tweak this and I go for these 3 running backs who are all playing as teams.
And so, I've got my locks, I've got my 5 that I'm really confident about, but I'm really not sure about the wide receiver position. There's actually like 5 or 6 or 7 players I like there, so I'm actually going to construct different rosters with those different players.
So the big thing about fantasy up to this point was that there was no real official money changing hands. Now everybody puts money in at the start of the year, and somebody's job is to mine the money and chase the money, and it's very annoying.
And you might get paid at the end of the season, or you might not. And, the guy who's your commissioner who holds the money might pay his rent, or he might,
People
you might get paid at 6 months. Yeah, exactly. And that was always a complaint. And it was really a bit of a cottage industry. So there was 30 million people playing it, but they typically were playing it in friends leagues where the money was being handled offline. And so we wanted to kind of make that process more efficient and also allow you to play against people that you didn't know. And so we sort of centralized the money pool.
Yeah, and so all of a sudden, everybody who's interested in fantasy has this other outlet for it against random people or against their mates, and they know the money's being looked after. So it's this kind of sweet spot of timing and technology.
Yeah.
And the boom in fantasy sports as well.
Yeah. So fantasy sports and season-long fantasy sports is still booming. And particularly fantasy football has continued to grow. I think last year they said there was something like 57 million fantasy sports players in North America. It's just an astronomical number. I think if you're male aged 18 to 35, something like 40% of them play fantasy sports. So it's just a massive demographic. But what we find is with daily fantasy sports is that it's growing 3, 4, 5x year on year. So it's not a sort of 20, 30%. It's just exploding in growth. And what we're finding is that it's what our thesis was, is that people like the fact that it's a mobile experience. You can draft, play, everything's on your phone. People love the ability to they love the format of daily, because with season long, I'm kind of locked into my roster, right? With daily, you're now interested in every player. And so even if that player's not on your team, you're thinking that guy might be in my player tomorrow. And then just thirdly is just kind of the excitement of rush of kind of, of using your skill for these enormous prize pools.
So how much does it actually cost to enter a competition? You've talked about the million one. How much is the entry fee for that?
So the entry fee for that one's $25, but we have tournaments from $1 upwards. So, we really, what we try and prize is variety. Some people want to come in and they want to play for $5 once a week, right? We have people who come and play against their dad or something for $5, and they do it, and that's the thing they do on a Sunday. And we have other people who want to play for $25, $50, $100 and want to play multiple lineups and want to play in all of our tournaments. We try to cater to everyone from the casual player to the very high volume player.
Yeah, because you can see how this, if you're a teenager or if you're like a mathematician.
Not teenagers.
Sorry, if you're 18 stroke 19 or is it 21?
18's our limit.
This is a potential viable career for you if you're clever enough about it.
Yeah, so it is a game of skill. That's very importantly, and legally it's a very important distinction that it is a game of skill, and we can show that. We can show when if you have a high skill player comes in and plays against somebody who's of low skill, the high skill player wins around 9 out of 10 times. So skill predominant. But what does that also mean? It means that if somebody is of very high skill level, then they can play and they can win consistently, and that's just a factor of being a skill game.
Are you starting to see those people emerge? The
yeah, we definitely do see it, and again, a huge mix and ecosystem, and so there are those people at the very top level. I think it's a hard game to be good at, and I think it's very hard to be good at multiple sports. You find that some people are great at baseball, and then come football, they, maybe their enthusiasm's higher than their skill level. So I think it's hard to be good at multiple sports. But yes, there is definitely people who are winning at a very big level.
Okay, so just spool us back a little bit then to you and your 4 co-founders. There's 5 of you sitting outside the house in South by Southwest, and you're like fantasy sports. How do you get from there to having a viable product, and how does that go from being one of the ones that dominates the market?
Yeah, it's a good question. When we launched our first product, HubDub, that was really a vision of something that was really cool, and I thought this would be awesome, and I went out to convince the world, and the world wasn't really convinced, which made me realize that probably wasn't a great way of building a business. And so when we came to FanDuel, we sort of fell in with customer development. If you've read Steve Blank's book, because obviously lean startup movement has become really popular now, and we really used that. And so it helped that we knew absolutely nothing about the sector we were going into. I know it's a funny assistance, but it meant that we couldn't come in with preconceived notions of what would work. And so we came out with a product and said, let's get a product out early and let's test with users and let's iterate. And we did that. I remember actually one time getting a very long email from a user telling me how our product was wrong in so many different ways. And I remember getting into an argument with them, and I was like, stopped myself before I hit send, and I said, hey, can we have a call? Like, can we talk? And so he's like, sure. So I phone him up. This guy had been playing fantasy sports for like 25 years. He knew everything I didn't know, right?
Yeah.
And he was exactly right. And he convinced me that our product was wrong and the things we needed to change. Turned to our co-founding team and said, look, this is what we need to change. It feels difficult. And they're like, we can do that in 2 weeks. Changed the product, and literally it was like night and day. And we suddenly were like, and so suddenly we realized that whenever we got into an argument of a user, a lot of times they're right, you know, and so that definitely, and so that whole customer development methodology was very, very important for us.
In a way, there's humility there, and did that, a little bit of that come from the fact that your first project had actually failed?
Yeah, like, you know, I think everyone, to start a company, it's enormously scary, and I think you need to have real vision and belief that you're going to be right and successful, and you have to block out, because everybody's going to say it's going to fail, right?
Yeah.
You block that all out to get out there. But the problem is, a lot of times they're right. And so it's quite hard to block out, you block out everybody, but sometimes you should be listening. And so, but with our second one, I think where we got to said, look, I'm convinced we've got a really good team. I'm convinced that if we continue to work at it, we will get there. But I think the second time around, we listened a lot more and took the feedback, whereas before we were like, you know, like this here, we listened and took feedback from customers.
And at what point do you realize it's a success? When do you kind of go, hang on a second?
I don't, you know, like I think any true entrepreneur is never happy, like never, like it's a success. I don't look at ourselves today and say it's a success. I'd say, you know, there might be a measure which I'd say earlier.
For our audience, though, it is a massive success.
But like, you know, as a measure, I think there's the point at which you think, we're not going to go bust like next week. Like that's a good measure of success.
When did that happen then?
Well, so early on, there was a point where it was clear to me that certainly some users really like the product. And so you kind of go through a process, you'll find this with investors, like they'll always find the next reason why it's not going to be successful. Like you're like, that's great, you've got some users, but it's never going to, you know, it's never going to go mainstream, or, you know, and it's like, well, if it does, but it's going to be too expensive to acquire those users. And so early on, we identified there was a small group of players that really loved it and they were sticking with the product. And so we had early signs. It was probably about a year later where we were kept growing, and when I started to meet lots of our users, and that, in meeting them, I realized that they weren't niche. They were mainstream sports fans, because that was the other accusation. Like, a lot of investors looked at our product and said, well, it's really hard to play and I wouldn't play it.
Yeah.
And what the problem was that it wasn't built for people who had very little free time and were more casual sports fans, which was most VCs, right?
Yeah.
And so it was built for people who had a lot of free time and really wanted to devote themselves to it. And so in that second year, when we started to spend a lot of time with our players, we realized it was mainstream, but it was probably only, that was our first year, and then I'd say in our second year, we started to get a repeatable acquisition channel. So that was, we could acquire a user for a certain value, and we knew the lifetime value was significantly greater. And that was the point at which we felt it's a mainstream product, the players love it, and we've got unit economics at scale. And that was where we felt that we were not bust.
Where did you recruit those? Where was the easiest place to recruit those? Because I mean, they're sports fans, so I'm guessing around the.
So sports is. What we find is, as a consumer product, sports is a great category to be in. And the reason for that is, sports, as an advertiser, you want the highest concentration of the people you're trying to target. Now, imagine you've got a product, like most consumer products, like, say, butter, right? You're selling butter. And, well, it's mostly female, and it's mostly read these magazines, but there's a lot of people that don't buy it. There's reasons they don't buy that product. Whereas, if I'm on sports media, I know that 100% of those people are into sports.
Yeah.
And so that meant, so what we did is, instead of saying one particular channel, what we did is we looked at sports media and said, let's be where the sports fan is. And so we went to sports radio, we went onto Facebook and targeting sports fans, we went to sports TV, we went to Twitter targeting sports fans. So really start with the fan. What media does he consume? And sports fans consume loads of media.
Yeah.
So there's lots of different ways we could touch him, and that's how we really got our marketing strategy.
Okay, so it starts to explode, and it starts to become this thing that is sponsoring teams and in bed with the leagues, and your employees, obviously, to meet the demand, you have to employ vast amounts more people. How do you manage being a small company and suddenly, pretty much overnight, okay, 5 years and overnight success, but that's the way these things work.
And it's true. Like, we grew from 5 co-founders. I think a year later we had 8, and then I think we went to sort of 25, 30. Up to the end of last year, we had about 120 people. We're at 500 people today, less than a year later. I think the slow burn in the early days have been very, very valuable to us as a company, because it allowed us to sort of build our DNA, to recruit the kind of core people that were going to be, very important in our growth. I think it might have been harder if we'd grown quickly early on, because it's quite jarring to go from 120 to 500 people. But we've been able to do it because I knew the people that we had in place a year ago were the right people that I could say, you can go and hire 50, 100 people, and I know you'll do a good job because we've hired well there. And that's, for me, it's about hiring really good people at the senior level you can trust to go and hire people.
You're obviously based in this part of the world?
I'm originally from Northern Ireland, originally from Tyrone.
And so where's the business now?
So New York's our headquarters, but we've got offices in Orlando, Los Angeles, Edinburgh, and Glasgow.
And did you set it up in New York?
We originally started in Edinburgh, 2009, and then we moved our headquarters to New York in 2011.
Okay. Obviously, it's been a massive story just recently about the whole regulation of the daily fantasy sports. So what is the situation with it? What's your take on this?
Fantasy sports is this sort of cottage industry. It didn't have, it was a non-regulated market. It's legal because contests of skill are legal in 45 US states that we operated in. But there really wasn't much beyond that. Like, the reason also why there wasn't much attention was because people just didn't really care, right? And we knew as we saw daily fantasy sports scaling that suddenly it was going to be much more visible. And we realized that its days as being an unregulated market were really kind of numbered. Like, people were going to take attention. There's lots of money going through the system. And so as an industry, what we started to do was to put in self-regulation. So we work with a trade association, and about a year ago, I wrote a charter which all members in the FSTA, which is a trade association, have signed up to, on how we run our businesses. And so that was sort of the first step.
As a matter of interest, that's really you and your main competitors, right? Because they're the ones that
there's about 500 companies in the FSTA.
But there's you and DraftKings, which are the ones that everybody knows about.
We're the main daily fantasy sports operators. But the other members of the FSTA are Yahoo, ESPN, CBS, so other big companies who are also signatories to that.
Okay.
And then sort of what happened more recently is an absolute acceleration of the need for self-regulation, but also the need for state-level regulation. And most of the focus there is on consumer protection, and we're supportive of that. And we sort of see that, people, and a lot of the concern and the PR really coming on recently was people wanted to know the games were fair, and they wanted to know that their data was being protected. And legislators also wanted that. And so that's really what we're seeing now. Now, we thought that process may take a couple of years to kind of play out. That has been compressed, and now we're seeing multiple states now saying, we want to see regulation in this state. We want to see consumer protection in this state. And so we're having to engage on that.
Yeah, I guess one of the very clever things that happened was that the leagues realized that this was going to be a massive source for revenue, and the teams realized it, and so they've decided that they want you as part of this.
Yes.
And so instead of you being the ones who are lobbying the states, it's these massive iconic sports brands that are going, these are our guys. You know.
Well, so the leagues have been supportive of fantasy sports for years. And actually, many of them, like the NFL, offer their own fantasy sports product. Why do they support fantasy sports? Well, it's a massive driver of consumption of sports. Just to give you an example, for us, before somebody is a fantasy basketball player on FanDuel, they'll watch an average 4 games a week. Afterwards, they'll watch 7. You get a 75% increase in the number of games they watch. They watch games where they're not a fan of either team, and they watch games that are blowouts. Sometimes the best game to watch if you've got a couple of players in that team. So it's a huge driver of their business, which is, and they're very open about it. We think this is good for our business, and we think that it's good for fans, it's good for the sports league, it's good for the teams, it's good for the networks. And so it's kind of a win-win for everyone.
But in a way, it's actually good for you guys that this has happened now before it goes any further, because you have to deal with it. And once you get it locked down, and once you hammer out that deal with the various legislation bodies, it's cast in stone.
So we want to, and we want to get through. We want to get through this, and we want to get sort of smart regulation in place. I think one of the things that we've learned, over the last month or so was that, this is a necessary condition, and this is something that we want the industry to adopt, because, even if, a small player does something stupid, that reflects badly on the entire industry. And so we need to make sure there's compliance across the industry.
So you're hopeful that a deal will happen pretty soon?
Well, so the thing about the way things work in the U.S. is that, this is a state-level issue. This is a social issue, and so, we're working, we would be working with legislators in 45 or 50 states, hopefully, to say, look, it's people love fantasy sports. There's like millions of people who play fantasy sports in your state. They want the assurance that they can continue to play, and they want to have consumer protection, that it's fair, and that they're being protected. And so that's where we want to get to.
It's not a bad problem to have to be negotiating with 50 different states. It's obviously a sign that the business has been successful.
Well, no, that's true. That's one way of looking at it.
One last thing. This part of the world, fantasy hasn't really had the kick up the ass that you guys have been to the fantasy industry. Is certainly, the UK, is that an interesting market for you guys? Or?
So we've funnily enough, having started in the UK 6 years ago, and it was always kind of 1 year out. It is now 1 year out, and this 1 year out is real. So we think there's a really interesting market for fantasy here. We don't think it's a cut and paste of our current product. We think our product in the US is very, very localized to the US market, and so we will have a product in market next year, but we're very kind of we're being a bit like how we launched in the US. We're not going to just jump to conclusions about what people want to play here, and so that product's in development, but it's very much in development in consultation with customers. Should it look like this or like that, and how should it actually work?
Well, because the problem with the Premier League one is exactly the same problems that you diagnosed earlier. You pick your team, and 3 weeks in, you're like, this team is rubbish. I'm going to have to play my wild card. But also, there's never really a purpose for it. It's the money in the office. Whereas at least with this, there's the opportunity. This weekend, my tenor's gone.
Like without a doubt, we believe we're going to be a lot more exciting than that out of the gate, but I want it to be the phenomenon that it is in the US, and that's a pretty high bar. And so, and I just do think that there's things that are going to be very different in the UK and Irish market that we just need to be aware of and addressing.
The actual final question is: you have a bona fide rival in the marketplace, and sometimes from the outside it feels like companies benefit from that. That actually, without a proper rival, you're not always necessarily inspired to constantly be on the edge of changing. Do you believe that, or would you just rather crush them?
To be honest, from what I said, I think competition in the market is phenomenal. I think it's we've always been in a very competitive market. When we launched in 2009, we had competitors, and throughout that, and the competitors have changed. There's nothing like having an aggressive competitor to really buck everybody up in the team. And I actually, there was one probably 6 month window when we didn't have an aggressive competitor. And I just felt we went sidewards. We kind of looked at different opportunities, and we weren't focused. And it's having an aggressive competitor that makes everybody focus. So I think it's a very good thing for any company. If you don't have an aggressive competitor, go out and create one, because it that's what creates a market. And you look at some companies that don't have aggressive competitors in the early days, and I think they lose it. They lose a competitive edge, and they fail to kind of really seize the opportunity of the market.
Yeah. Well, listen, it's a phenomenal success story. Congratulations, Nigel.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.